So, Rabbi Aaron Boxt here for episode number 3 of my podcast. So, last week I spoke about perspective and looking at and the way that we look at the world and how our perspectives, our views on the world are often influenced by even the most mundane of things and sometimes even some of the greatest or most amazing of things. And what I'd like to talk about this week is the youth. I know it's cliche, the youth are our future, but there's so much truth to that. So I had the amazing blessing and opportunity of spending a little over 24 hours with a group of teens from Jewish teens from parts of Florida, from Ocala all the way down to, I guess, Miami. And it was really amazing to sort of watch them interact with each other and think back to how life was like when I was a teenager, when I was in this youth group organization. And although there are lots of similarities between when I was a kid to when these guys are a kid, there are lots of differences as well. The kids today, especially teenagers and high school students, are really faced with a lot more stuff in some respects than we ever were. Yes, of course, social media and all that goes with that, whether it's Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook or Twitter or any of the other social media outlets that are used, TikTok, of course. These kids, these young adults, are faced with so many more things that are much more in their face right there in front of them than when I was a teen. And while there are lots of advantages to that, there's also certainly disadvantages to that. And I think about what it's like. What would it be like if I were 17 years old today? And I'm not sure that A, I really want to think about that, or B, that I would be as successful today as I was when I was 17. Not to say that I was the world's greatest 17-year-old, but I had a, a pretty fairly decent life when I was 17. And I look at the way that my daughter interacts with her friends, and there's just so much that they are faced with and so much that is right in front of them. And I think about, could it have been that way for me when I was 17 or older generations when they were 17? Of course, we always say, life was so much more difficult when X, or life was so much easier now than it was back when. I'm not so sure that that's true. And if you sit down and have a real conversation with a teenager these days and ask them, what's hard about life, you might find some difference, some things that you weren't sure of or that you weren't aware of. I'll give you an example that I can think of. When I applied for college back in 1993, I applied to 3 schools and I got into all 3 schools. But back then, it was my SATs, my GPA, and my academic resume, and a short essay that I had to write about myself or about something in particular. These days, these kids have to have these these amazing essays that they have to write. And while the SATs and or the ACTs aren't necessarily required by all colleges, the interview for these colleges is so much more demanding. I don't even think I had an interview when I applied to college. I know for certain I would not get into the University of Georgia today with the grades I had back in 1993. Because the academic standards are so much higher now than they were back then. And that's a good thing. But it's also very stressful if you are applying for schools. And it's not just about the academics, it's also, I don't remember if we had requirements for community service. Obviously, I was very involved with Interact and other social justice things when I was in high school, but I don't remember it being a requirement. Today, you can't even graduate without X amount of hours of these programs. And I just feel like, taking AP classes back in the 90s was hard, but today it seems almost impossible. Yet these kids are able to do it and do well. And I think that there's also so much more that's asked of these kids, because if you think about, forget the politics of where you live, and obviously that is a major issue, but think about what these kids have to think about: gun control, guns in school, um, child pregnancy that yes existed before this generation, but with what's going on in our world today, there's so much more there. There's so much more that's stressful, um, and I would be remiss if I didn't think about how much life could be easier if these kids had a few less stressors. And I was always taught that the job of adults is to make life easier for the kids that come after us. And I hope to God that we're doing that, but I'm not sure. Have we made life harder in many ways or in some ways? And I think that is really, you know, if you sit there and have a conversation with a teenager about their day at school or about what's going on in their mind, uh, I think that it would be very different today than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and so on and so forth. Um, there were pressures back then, but there are different pressures now, different stresses now. And I really hope that as we move forward in the future, that we can do better for our youth and do better for our teens. And instead of just automatically assuming that life is going to be easier for them or that life is easier for them, take some time to actually think about and talk to them and find out, what are the areas of their life that are the most demanding? And how can we, as the adults in their lives, how can we make their lives easier or less demanding, I guess is the right way of looking at it. Um, just something to think about this week. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week and weekend. And I'll see you next week at my next podcast. Thanks for listening.